everyone, it's Kristin. Welcome back to my channel where we talk about languages and travel. So if you are a fellow language learner and you are learning your second language, like me, chances are you've come across a situation where you meet someone and they speak multiple languages and are just attempting the language that you want to learn, and they're doing amazing at it. This has happened to me several times. During my longest stay in Japan, when I was really immersing myself in the language and culture, I had already been studying for a few years at that point, so I could carry on a conversation relatively well. But there was this other person there who came from a different country where they spoke a couple different languages already, and they had just started learning Japanese, a couple months maybe. And this person was able to just have full-on conversations with people and just not stop. They would make mistakes all the time, but they just kept going, kept learning. And me, as a person who had been studying for several years at that point and knew more than this person, was struggling to really be able to actually speak the language. I'm sure I'm not the only person that has ever experienced this. Chances are, if you are a fellow language learner and maybe you come from a country where English is the almost sole spoken language, you might run into a situation like this. So why does it seem so much more difficult sometimes for a monolingual English speaker to learn a new language? I believe one of the reasons is our attitude/culture. So by attitude, I don't mean that you have a bad attitude, but our attitude about language learning is very much impacted by our culture. Here in America, for example, there is almost no absolute need to learn a second language. Even for people in the tourism or travel industry like myself, are not required to learn a second language or to know a second language. Whereas in other countries, for example, like Japan, you can go to any normal information booth and they will most likely speak English. Some very well, some at least enough to communicate to you what you need to know. And in many other countries, flight attendants like myself are required to speak more than one language. Here in America, we don't even prioritize language learning in schools. I, for instance, started in high school, which is pretty old to be just starting to learn a second language. I feel like America has kind of a culture of apathy, you could say, towards other languages. Like, it's cool if you know them, but it's really not necessary. Even if you don't personally believe that, I think it does kind of get into your subconscious in the way that you approach language learning and your attitude about it. It doesn't feel necessary or urgent. There's a few ways you can work around this though, if you do tend to fall into that sort of apathetic style of language learning. You could try imposing a sense of urgency on yourself by giving yourself a deadline, or totally immersing yourself into the language by moving to the country or spending a significant amount of time there. If you are a monolingual native English speaker, I do think it's a little bit harder to learn a second language in your home country, because it's hard to break out of sort of that culture and mindset if you're not exposed to a different culture and mindset. My second point is monolingual English speakers tend to start learning languages later in life. Like I mentioned earlier, I started in high school, so 17, 18. When a person starts this late, first of all, don't think it's too late. It's never too late. But you do have different challenges to overcome compared to someone who grew up knowing two languages or learned a second language earlier on in life. Our brain is a muscle. So someone who has learned more than one language from birth or early on in their lives, they have already developed the muscle for knowing more than one language and switching between those languages. However, I don't subscribe to the idea that a person can't learn a second language later on in life, or even is worse at learning languages than a child is. A lot of people seem to think this, but I don't think it's true at all. It's absolutely possible to learn a second language later on in life. I do believe though that when you are just starting out learning your second language, you are gonna have to build up that brain muscle, and it's gonna be a little bit more of a learning curve for you. But I went through it and I'm still going through it, but you can do it. It definitely takes some time and struggle, and you might feel disadvantaged compared to someone who has grown up speaking more than one language. But don't compare yourself to other people, because in the end, it only matters what you achieve. So another difficulty that I have personally experienced is when you do try and put yourself out there and immerse yourself in a language, hoping to make it feel more urgent to you that you have to learn this language. For English speakers, when people see you and it's obvious that you are not from that country, they will speak to you in English. This even happened to my friends who English was not their first language, but they were very obviously not from Japan, so they were spoken to in English before the person realized that they could speak to them in Japanese. So that's why sometimes it's better to put yourself in a situation where there will be very few people who even can speak English. So like somewhere in the countryside where there's not a lot of other foreigners. If you're just traveling for fun, this can be a little bit more difficult because likely you'll be staying at like a hostel or hotel, or like I was doing a work away with a bunch of other volunteers who are also from multiple different countries. And when you're in those kind of situations, the universal language that people fall back on when it's a multicultural place is English. So that just makes it a little bit harder to force yourself to speak your target language consistently. Don't let that be an excuse though. There are ways around it. You just have to be aware that that is probably going to happen and plan around it. Keep in mind that these are all my subjective thoughts and experiences though. Everyone's going to have a slightly different experience, and maybe some of these things don't apply to you personally. But if some of them did resonate with you, just don't let them become an excuse to hold you back from reaching your goals. It's okay to be aware of some things that might be extra challenging for you, but you can always work through it, work around it, and just find what works for you. So I hope some of this resonated with you. Comment below if it did. Let me know how you've been getting on in your own language studies. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.